3 minutes. I'm sorry? We still have like 3 minutes. Hello. Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started in less than a minute here. All right. My name is Isra Bashir. I am the director of the Art Museum and Galleries. Thank you all so much for joining us today, both in person and virtually, and in supporting our programming. I especially want to thank the team at the Institutional History Museum for providing us with the space to do so. A special thank you as well to the Employee Resource Group for Asian, Asian American, and Pacific Islander for their sponsorship. And of course, my deep appreciation goes to my dedicated team who are holding down the fort. Robert Forsberg in the back, Nayeli Willen, Rachel Marks, Jessica Wager. Thank you all so much for making this evening possible. It is a true pleasure to welcome Professor Banu Subramaniam to Washington and Lee University. Her lecture entitled For the Love of Plants, Plant Worlds in the Shadows of Empire engages with recent interdisciplinary scholarship in feminist, postcolonial, and indigenous studies. Through this talk, she will examine how gender, race, class, sexuality, and nation shape the very language, terminology, and theories of modern plant sciences, exposing the colonial histories embedded within them. Professor Subramaniam is an interdisciplinary scholar and plant scientist whose recent book, Botany of Empire, Plant Worlds, and the Scientific Legacies of Colonialism, interrogates the colonial underpinnings of plant taxonomy, plant reproductive biology, and plant biogeography. This work aligns deeply with the themes of our current museum programming, which seeks to uncover hidden histories and challenge dominant narratives. The book will be available for purchase and signing after the Q&A. Before introducing Avery Dennard, an officer with our Museum Student Engagement Committee, who will share the professor's full bio, I want to take a moment to highlight how Professor Subramaniam's visit connects with our larger museum initiative this year. This year's programming is inspired by two concurrent exhibitions, Stephanie Shee's Long Time No See and Emma Steincross's Impossible Garden, Dusk and Dawn. The academic year began with artist talks, followed by a student writing workshop and a public reading with award-winning poet Sally Wynn Mao, and a keynote lecture by physicist, ceramicist, and Stanford Art Institute director Hideo Mabuchi, and a Lunch and Learn series which aims to answer critical questions. Whose voices and stories have shaped our dominant historical narratives? Whose voices and stories have been excluded, erased, and hidden, and how can we render them more visible? Looking ahead, our programming continues through May, featuring a mugwort cooking demonstration with New York recipe developer Zoe Yang, a wildflower walk with Emma Steincross, and a closing ceremony of Long Time No See with Stephanie Shee, alongside a lecture by William R. Sargent, the former curator of Asian export art at the Peabody Essex Museum. Professor Subramaniam's research resonates deeply with WNL Assistant Art Professor Emma Steincross's Impossible Garden, which foregrounds the historical neglect of female artist naturalists. The exhibition showcases over 400 illustrations by 136 women between the 16th and 19th century who document flora, fauna, and fungi across the Americas, Europe, and Asia. Impossible Garden is currently on view in Watson Galleries through May 4th of this year. Similarly, and finally, Long Time No See, an original collection of 15 life-size photographic and video-based installations, examines the unacknowledged histories within our renowned collection of Chinese export ceramics. Our inaugural artist-in-residence, Stephanie Shee, explored these ceramics in the context of commerce, labor, imperialism, migration, identity, and she placed them being the ceramics, in dialogue with food, flowers, personal artifacts, and culturally significant objects from the Asian diaspora. The exhibition is on view currently at the Rees Museum of Ceramics through June 7th. With that, I am honored to welcome Professor Subramaniam to WNL. I'll now turn it over to Avery, who will read her full bio. Thank you.
Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Avery Dennard, and I serve as the programming officer at the Museum's Student Engagement Committee. The committee is a student-run organization working with the museums at WNL to bring students into the galleries for educational and creative pursuits, inspiring a passion for the arts and culture through events like this one. Dr. Banu Subramaniam is the Luella Lemare Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Wellesley College. Dr. Subramaniam received her Bachelor of Science from the University of Madras, India, and her PhD in Zoology and Genetics from Duke University. Originally trained as an evolutionary biologist and plant scientist, Dr. Subramaniam's pioneering research in feminist science studies has made her a leader in the field. Her work explores the philosophy, history, and culture of the natural sciences and medicine as they relate to gender, race, ethnicity, and caste. She's the author of 3 books, the latest of which, Botany of Empire, Plant Worlds, and the Scientific Legacies of Colonialism, focuses on decolonizing botany and rethinks the field and practice of botany in relation to histories of colonialism and xenophobia, and explores the wide travels of scientific theories, ideas, and concepts as they relate to migration and invasive species. In 2019, she published Holy Science, The Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, which won the 2020 Michelle Kendrick Memorial Book Prize from the Society for Literature, Science, and the Arts. The book focuses on how science and religion have become interwoven in emergent nationalist policies and novel conceptions of modernity in India. Her previous book, Ghost Stories for Darwin, The Science of Variation and the Politics of Diversity, is the winner of the Ludwig Fleck Prize in 2016 for an outstanding book across the breadth of science and technology studies. She is co-editor of Feminist Science Studies, A New Generation, that put feminist science studies on the map, and Meat, a transnational analysis which looks at human-animal-plant relations and at the production and consumption of meat and its alternatives from the vantage of a wide range of interdisciplinary scholars working at the intersections of the sciences and the humanities. Her latest book, Botany of Empire, is available for purchase right over here after the lecture, And afterwards, we will hold a Q&A section, so please be sure to stick around. And for those of you joining us virtually, please leave your questions using the chat feature. To stay up to date on our programming and student opportunities, follow us on Facebook or Instagram at wlu.museums. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Banu Subramaniam to the stage.
Thank you, Avery, for that very thorough introduction. Oh, there you are. I'm really so delighted to be here and wanted to thank ISRA for the invitation. And this was a kind of arduous, because I was scheduled to come before, and then I don't know if it's the elements or higher powers intervened, and there was a storm. And so I'm really glad to be here, and thank you all for taking the time to be here. I also want to thank Jessica, who's done a superb organization in getting me here, and her hospitality all day and taking me around town. Thank you. And Nayeli, who did a wonderful tour through Stephanie Shee's Long Time No See exhibit, and she did it so well. I spent the afternoon integrating thoughts about that experiment with the talk I was about to give. And so to some extent, I really found her a very kindred spirit. It would have been a better talk had I gone through it earlier, but I think you will see the connections. And we have shared histories, but yet they're different. And part of the shared history, I think, is how we think about immigration in this country. And these are two quotes, very different quotes, with very different imagination of America and who America is. One, which is about welcoming everyone, being a nation of immigrants, and being welcoming and accommodating and inclusive. The other, Ronald Reagan, who has a particular vision of the nation and who should belong and who shouldn't, and that it is a particular vision we develop and then we control who comes and not. And part of what I hope I will convince you in this talk is that these tensions of these vision are tensions that go back a very, very long time. And they go back not only through human histories, but also go back through plant histories. And that's in part what Botany of Empire is. And the central argument of that book is that we think of the botanical sciences, or indeed any sciences, as keeping up with the times. We discover new things and we change, and knowledge is current. But part of what I'm arguing in that book is that botanical theories, why do plants have sex? Why are plants named the way they are? How do we understand plant biogeography? We could go to Darwin or evolutionary biology. So any of these topics, I argue, the theories we use really come from colonial histories. And that if we really cared about plants, that if we loved plants, that we ought to rethink plants in their own register rather than through colonial human histories. And I'll show you one case study that I hope will convince you. I'm happy to be challenged at the end in the Q&A. So part of what connects, I think, Stephanie Shee's and mine is thinking about Asian American. She does Asian American culture, personal history, objects, although there are a lot of plants in the installations as well. I am thinking about the natural world, but again, the natural world is cultural, and she shows the cultural world is natural. And there's this wonderful framing of understanding the world as nature cultures, as one word. And so thinking through that. To give you a little biography of how I came into a life in biology, I grew up in India, and I don't know if there's anyone else who did, but one of the things that when you grow up in, you grow up with Indian mythological stories. And there are two main mythological stories, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And in these stories, plants talk, animals talk, things can move from plant to animal, things get transformed, gods become humans, human becomes gods. Gods take avatars of various forms of plant and animal. So it was a kind of very magical childhood that fueled an imagination of a very different kind of world. And also, plant worlds and animals worlds were integrated in an everyday way. And I think a lot of you might resonate with this, but growing up, a lot of the plants, then common names describe the plant, right? It was yellow, or it was prickly, or it was, it helped with this digestive ailment or that. So they were very utilitarian ways in which we describe the world. And then, of course, once I went to biological education, everything became Latinized, right? And so part of what I felt a botanical education did was really an education in alienation from the world. I had to unlearn the common names that I knew, and I had to learn the Latin names of plants. And very often the Latin names of plants are some colonizer who came, and this whole idea of terra nullius, right? That the colonial powers go to a place, there are people been living there for a very long time, but it's like they discover it. They discover the plants. They name the plants after themselves, or sometimes the queen or the emperor or some general or military figure. And so these plants are rediscovered. And this is a very, very familiar story. And the other aspect, which I've heard from American colleagues as well, that growing up in urban India, I had little access to forests and hikes in the woods. And in fact, when I went to graduate school, so many of my friends, their summer vacations were camping in the national forests, or they had a river running through the backyard. And I just felt like such a bad biologist because I didn't have those experiences. And in part, it is through understanding the history and philosophy of science, I have come to understand my own biography as not necessarily a limiting biography, but a different way to get at these questions of natures and how we understand the natural world around them. So the heart of the argument, and this comes from my field of feminist science and technology studies, is that we don't understand the world of science and society and nature and culture as binary opposites, but understand them together. And I hope I will convince you of how entangled these worlds are. And so we should understand the world as nature cultures. And so, for example, if you take a term like race, race is not a consistent, stable formation if you look at the US in the last 100 years. So there's a wonderful book on how the Irish became white, right? They were not always considered white. And so there are ways in which social movements, the ways in which genetic technologies, how we classify different plants and animals, all of these shift with time. And so understanding how theories move from the worlds of nature and culture back to nature constantly tells us a lot about knowledge formations, rather than what we study, or certainly what I studied, right? That each discipline is unique and is the fount of knowledge through time, when in fact knowledge formation is far more complicated. And so what I want to talk about today is about the coloniality of botany, and in particular looking at plant biogeography. And here I want you to think about the long arc of the planet, of when once all the different continents were together in one supercontinent called Pangaea. And as the story goes, because of continental drift, all the different continents moved right across into their current formation. Plants that began life together in this one supercontinent moved to different parts, developed new kith and kin, new evolutionary strategies, new communities. And the prediction is one day all of them will come together into a new Pangaea. And I love to think of the stories that plants and animals will tell each other after their travels through millennia. And so we are a planet that is dynamic, that has been moving. And evolution, at the heart of evolution is change and mobility, and that's going to be the theme throughout. Environmental historians argue that Pangaea broke up into the modern continents, but what European colonialism starting in the 15th century did was reknit the seams of Pangaea. And part of what they did in reknitting the seams of Pangaea is they took plants willy-nilly across the world. Right? You know, we want tea gardens in India. We want to build Indian landscapes, British landscapes in India. We want to bring plants from other parts of the world and exhibit them in Kew Gardens and gardens across the world. We want orchids in our living room, right? So we build plantations in terms of crops and create monocultures of cotton or sugarcane. And so part of what the colonizers did was really build new Europes wherever they went. And colonialism thus created a world-spanning economic system where plants, animal, and people shuffled across the globe. And this is Albert Crosby's The Columbian Exchange, which is a very important book in environmental history. And so in many ways, I would argue, thinking about colonial times and plant movements, that was the original bioinvasion, because I'm going to talk about invasion biology today. And I want to track what happened from Pangaea to what happened during colonialism to the ways in which we talk about plants today. And I want to do this in 4 acts. Act 1, and here I want to invoke Stephanie. How many of you went to the exhibit? Okay, those who didn't, I highly recommend it. It's really, really quite a stunning and very thoughtful exhibit. So central to Xi's methods is understanding objects as her extended family, a vision that embraces the world into her fold. In this multimedia installation, she addresses the forgotten past, those who are lost to us, and returns stories back to them. History is never whole, as the broken ceramics remind us. In snippets, she reminds us of the rich histories of food, plant life, the sensual orchids, the rambunctious Chinese privet, delicate porcelain, uneaten food, rich incense, and joss paper. The homage to the spirits of the lost reminds us of the rich past of unfinished lives. And here I want to think about colonialism and what colonialism did. What was the project of colonialism? And I find Leanne Simpson very useful, and where she argues, really what the colonizers have always been trying to figure out is how do you extract natural resources from the land when the peoples whose territories you're on believe that those plant and animal minerals have both spirit and therefore agency. And she answers in 3 parts. First, you use gender violence to remove indigenous people and their descendants from the land. 2, you remove agency from the plant and animal worlds from the animal worlds. And 3, you reposition land as natural resources for the use and betterment of white people. And so these are 3 key things of how, and so part of colonialism was really targeting countries where there were rich natural resources or spices or something worth extracting. And colonial economies were extractive economies. So I want to use the case of invasion biology, which we read about in the papers every day, to think about how it's constructed and how we can think about it in this long history. I came to this project because I was working on an ecological experiment with colleagues Jim Beaver and Peggy Schultz, who were then at UC Irvine. And we were testing theories about native and alien plants and their relationship with native and alien soil. And at that time, I was also going, I am an immigrant to this country, and I was reading the biological literature, and then I was reading, every day, the papers and magazines. And I was really struck by how similar the language at every stage of immigration, of what plants and animals go to. And similarly, if you read how we are thinking about immigration, we talk about nature out of place, just as we talk about humans in place and out of place. So there's something very common in the categorization of immigration and how we view the immigrant. Within environmental history, we understand, environmental historians argue that we should understand colonialism and imperialism as fundamentally an ecological project. That's what it was about, even though we talk about a lot of, frame it in, it had lots of different implications. And even something like conservation biology has its roots in colonial times, so we should understand it as a form of green imperialism. Act 2, and this is the rose piece. So these are different installations from Stephanie Shee. In a deeply nature cultural account, she juxtaposes the life of flowers and humans. Those marginalized, unwanted, feared, disdained, share nature cultural histories. In a beautiful installation with color and black and white script, light and shadows, filled and empty spaces, she reminds us of our shared history. Texts from newspapers are part of that installation, and that remind us the Chinese are non-assimilable and undesirable immigrant. Shall Negroes and Chinese vote? And alongside it is the flower, multiflora rose, as an invasive, undesirable species. The rose piece brings the racial history of the US as a trans-species phenomenon. We are all caught up in these racial logics. And so when you think about invasion biology today, and if you think about the US about 100 years ago, it was a very different world. We had the USDA that sent scientists across the world to find new and interesting species. So someone like David Fairchild, one scientist, brought over 200,000 species into the US. The American Acclimatization Society, someone said, why don't we bring every bird named in Shakespeare's plays into US Central Park? It's like, why not? So someone did. It's just to give you a sense of that kind of laissez-faire attitude of moving plants and animals willy-nilly, and a lot of that happened during those times. And historians chronicle, with the rise of immigration into this country and the rise of nature-loving as a particularly a white American experience. So here's Adam Rose, who argues, in the decades after the US-American Civil War, industrialization, urbanization, and westward expansion transformed the nation's landscapes and redefined Americans' relationship with nature. This new love of nature was evidenced in the dramatic growth in the number of Americans who considered themselves nature lovers. And Americans saw their love of nature as the quality that distinguished the natives from the new immigrants. A love for nature translated into a zeal to protect nature, and immigrants came to be seen as not loving nature as the problem. And so this is where a love of nature and environmentalism becomes particularly racialized. And you can see that as we see the rise of Black ecology, of narratives of various African-American ecologists who talk about, we always say, oh, go into the forest and the calmness of the forest will calm you down. The trees are beautiful, you breathe the air, right? So this is the narrative we are often given. But if you talk to people who grew up in this country who had very different experiences of the wild, where these were places of violence, these were places of lynching, and very often that they ran into it, and these were places of violence. So we also need to recognize that nature is not some universal category that we all experience the same way. And these histories shape our individual experience of those spaces. And it's useful to be mindful of how these histories of immigration shape our relationship with nature. Act 3, driving out the pig. She powerfully shows us the stark racial and racist politics of American immigration. The pig, with its floral eyes, speaks to the multiple registers of American life. In the center of the installation is a statement, some reasons for Chinese exclusion. Meat versus rice, American manhood against Asian coolieism, which shall survive? As anti-Chinese sentiments have grown since COVID-19, we see these politics endure to this day. And so after that laissez-faire, plants and animals and people were taken for different needs across the world, you begin to see Western powers close their borders. And so in the US, you see the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And it's interesting, it is 1 year after the state's quarantine law for plants, right? So again, a very nature cultural view on how we have dealt with immigration. Of course, after the Chinese Exclusion Act, we have other immigration act that limited the entry of all European immigrant groups. So now we're into a world where we have borders and we police these borders. And so let's think about this field we call invasion science or invasion biology today. So by definition, invasive species have to be foreign species, by definition. And as a field, it really developed in 1980s, 1990s, and now every state has an invasion species program. Any Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, any group has it. There are wanted lists. And part of what I want to chronicle for you is the ways in which the nature cultural world of immigration in the last 20 years. This is a children's book. Exotic alien species are infesting America. We start very, very early in frightening children about foreigners. Tinkering with Eden. Again, this idea that there was an Eden before, and part of what Kim Todd chronicles is the ways of the reception of exotics into this country and the argument that there was an Eden before and exotics have destroyed that Eden. And fields like restoration biology is about wanting to go back, the vision of going back to something in the past. Since we have been in a perpetual war for some 2 decades now, that language of invasion, battles, wars are everywhere in invasion science and invasion biology. Of how species are threats, of different alert levels, color-coded alert levels, of the ways in which they are watching us and how we need to watch them back. At the heart of it, the argument is that the problem is a borderless world, and that if we create borders, we will be more secure. So just like we have homeland security, we need to be thinking of biosecurity and controlling what comes in and out of the country. Here are some titles from newspapers and magazines. Alien invasion, they're green, they're mean, and they may be taking over a park or preserve near you. Aliens wreaking havoc. Creepy strangler climbs Oregon's least wanted list. Alien threat. Invasive species, pathogens of globalization. What do you see as common in these titles? Fear, absolutely. What do you think they're talking about? Sorry? Invaders. And it's a very generic, right? They're not, all of these are about, not a single one is about humans. But they're all this classic fear of the outsider. And as I was reading these headlines, you begin to see how the fear of human immigrants and plants and animals kind of fuse into each other into this classic fear of the outsider. The creepy strangler is English ivy, right? And so it was repeatedly striking that how we talk about humans and plants and animals were very similar. Foreigners are always unhygienic, disease, damage, ridden, and threat. They look weird. They're taking over everything. They're stealth destroyers. They're indestructible. And then the classic trope of the third world oversexed female as producing too many babies, the fear of cross-pollination and miscegenation. They're doing irreversible damage and ecological destruction, and they come in very stealthy ways. Act 4, gilding the lily soup. Gilding the lily soup brings us to the everyday, but reminds us that immigration does not rest in snapshots of history. Like plants, humans also evolve. Like the ceramics that had new colors added once they arrived in the UK, so does soup, food, flowers, and humans. So do these all find new lives in their new lands. Humans, plants, and objects entangled in nature cultures are dynamic and mobile, and their many histories constantly move, constantly change, constantly evolve. One of my favorite titles for this was, I think it's missing, the title was, They Came, They Bred, They Conquered, right? Which is at the heart of of the invasion biology. And here is kudzu, right, which we have all been, taught. And a little history about kudzu. So kudzu was originally exhibited here in the 1894 fair in Philadelphia, one of those World's Fair. And at that time, the USDA was really worried about soil erosion and was looking for a plant that might help prevent soil erosion. Kudzu is nitrogen fixing, so it would enrich the plant. In every way, it seemed like the ideal plant to grow. And so the USDA went to farmers and they paid them to plant kudzu per hectare. But of course, kudzu did something very different here than that it does in Japan. And I recently heard that even in Japan, if you, for the most part, it's not invasive in Japan, but if you clear cut, if there are disturbed areas, kudzu will behave the same way there as well. So the ecological context is important of why certain plants grow and why now we call it a mile a minute plant and food a night wine. But when we talk about invasive species today, even kudzu, we do not tell the story of how it came to be here. We just say this is an evil plant. And again, the kind of language we use around invasive species is often very violent, of really despising them. And since they're all foreigners, there's a way in which that xenophobia pervades how we, talk about kudzu. I don't know if any of you followed the TikTok videos around the spotted lanternfly, like last year. And it's like there were people, I mean, it's big, and so it may sort of squashing them and the sound that comes out of them. But it was just really kind of horrendous for me to watch those TikTok videos and the kind of pleasure that one is supposed to seek in destroying foreign species. Now, what is interesting is when people go around the world, especially formerly colonized countries, and look at naturalized species there to see what exists there and how can we explain it. And so a recent study basically shows that if you look at alien flora of former colonies, they carry the legacy of colonialism. So Spanish colonies look very similar in what's there. Dutch colonies look very similar. British colonies look very similar, but they look different from each other, right? So those colonial histories of the plants that these colonial powers took to colonize nations remain in the alien flora in those nations today. So the mark of colonialism lives on. What is always interesting to me is we do not act the same about all foreign species. So if you think of the cherry blossom, or the Georgia peach, which is Chinese in origin, or the tumbleweed, the classic character in any Western film, and the ones below are state flowers, not all of which come from somewhere outside there. And the question is, why do some species, do they become incorporated as icons of a nation versus other foreign species are so reviled? And so Karen Cardozo and I had worked on this and really thinking along with I'm realizing now, of thinking about Asian American as a nature culture, as a category. And so tracking histories of various foreign species coming from Asia and the stories we tell of them, along with the history of human Asian Americans. And part of what we're arguing here is that as long as plants know their rightful place as workers, laborers, and providers, and control commodities, their positions manipulated and controlled, their presence is tolerated. Nearly every crop, a lot of the vegetables we eat are all foreign, right? But we are never told to destroy that. We should only eat. If we only ate native foods, our repertoire would be small. But there are a lot of native foods we should be eating. But it turns out some of those species are not so easy to control, not so easy to breed and manipulate. So the things we eat have been easily domesticated, easy to crossbreed, to produce shelf-stable crops that we can sell. So we ultimately eat like four or five crops when there are so many things we can eat. But once foreign species are accused of unruly practices and that prevent them from staying in their subservient place. They threaten the natural order of things. And we see the same thing happen with respect to human, plant, or animal, about the ones that assimilate into, that we kind of accept, and the others that are reviled. One of the things that has been interesting as I've been tracking this literature of plant and humans for the last 20 years is how similar these, when something happens in the human world, you see it happen in the plant world. And environmental historians have shown that when you have moments of xenophobia, you have germ panics, you have panics about other species as well. So this goes back a very long time. And so recently, you have environmental groups who talk about, just like we have the militarized borders about human immigrants, we should also create a militarized environmental band called the Green Patriots. Just like we are supposed to see something, say something if we see something suspicious at the airport, there are apps for plants and animals and insects in particular. So if you see something, there's a place you can call and report them. What is particularly ironic, of course, in the US context is who the native is here, right? The native here are not the indigenous people, the native here are the white settlers. And so that invention and the construction of the idea of who is native and what we are restoring the world to takes on particular political poignancy, I think, in the US context. By all of this, I am not suggesting that we are not losing species. I am not suggesting we open the borders and let things go willy-nilly. What I am suggesting is that we need to move beyond our discourse of native and foreign, good and evil, and understand the world through the complex histories that have made us. In terms of biology, to me, invasive species are a symptom of a deeper ecological project, of the overdevelopment of our land, of how much of it we have destroyed. And most invasive species take off on disturbed land, and not in thriving communities that are going through ecological succession of various kinds. But it seems easier for us to mobilize people to spend every weekend pulling out individual invasive plants rather than mobilizing towards much larger environmental problems. But I think that's what we need to do if we are worried about the environment, if we are worried about the ecological degradation that's going on. And I just want to end by, my recent work, I'm trying to articulate an idea that I guess in a way opposes, or a different way to approach ecology in thinking about migrant ecologies instead of invasive ecologies. And part of the idea of migrant ecologies is really to work with the data as we have now, which is plants are anywhere and everywhere, given the histories that we have lived through, and that a nature cultural approach allows us to understand why we find various plants, animals, and humans in various parts of the world. It recognizes the idea that humans and non-humans have shared histories, much like she is talking about in many of her exhibits. It also tells tales of affective embodied ecology. Again, so much of She's work is about the ways in which plants and butterflies and beetles are so integrated in our lives, and that we have relationships with them. If you look at a lot of indigenous ecologies across the world, one thing they have in common is nature is part of the human, is not outside of the human. Versus much of the biological literature, humans are outside of biology, right? We study biology, but we are outside of it. So when humans are part of that biology, you develop a much more entangled history of plant, human, animal ways of living. In a lot of indigenous ecologies, burning is routine part of maintenance of the land. So it's not about the purity of nature, but about how do we find ways of living with each other without destroying each other. And I think Western epistemologies, especially plant sciences, at their foundation are about the separation, which I think develops very different stories that I think leads us to invasion biology. In migrant ecologies recognize that change and fluidity are part of it. These are not some things we work against, but we work with. So at this particular moment of climate change, rather than saying we need to restore things back to some idyllic past, when the climate has changed, the environment has changed, everything is adapted to a world that was. What does it mean to want to restore something, rather than working with what changes are happening and how we can imagine a world together where we can all thrive together? Migrant ecologies also tackles different multiple genealogies of colonialism. We have settler colonialism, decolonial thought, postcolonial thought, counter-colonial thought, the indigenous ecologies. It's a way in which we can incorporate the different histories of colonialism in other parts of the world. Also insisting that we think about multi-species, because after all, we all are integrated in a world. And so how do we develop a vision where we don't tell individual stories, but learn to tell stories together? And finally, there's this term diaspora, which we talk about humans, and we talk about diaspores with respect to seeds. There's a wonderful convergence of a nature cultural mode of thinking about dispersal and migration across human and animal. In I'm Gonna Live Forever, she reminds us that complex histories, past and present, beauty and the ugly, love and hate, joy and sorrow, new and old, live within us. We must understand it, reckon with it, and face the future with the lessons of the past. As ramen, and which is, I don't know if you can see them, cooked and uncooked flow from the branches of a beautiful bouquet of flowers, she reminds us that history is always half-cooked, and thus powerfully remind us that we have not all taken the same lessons from the past, that the future is ours for the telling, and tell it we must. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions, challenges, criticisms, compliments.
So we'll need you to speak into the microphone, and those of you who are joining us online, just don't forget to write your question into the chat.
Hello, thank you for being here. I'm Aiden. I'm a current junior here at Washington LA, and I just was wondering what brought you to start this research and this project. Thank you.
So I grew up in India, and a liberal arts education is so wonderful, but it's not one I had. So in India, at 10th grade, you have to choose going to the sciences, the arts, or commerce. And then in 12th grade, you have to choose which particular branch of it. So when I came to graduate school here in biology, I'd never taken a course in sociology or anthropology or any other social sciences or humanities. And so somewhere during graduate school, so my graduate work was on morning glory flower color variation. And I was talking to a colleague in women's studies, and usually most people would say, oh, very nice, and then we'll talk about something else. But she said, no, I really want to hear what you're working on. And so I explained how morning glories have all this flower color variation, and that we were trying to understand what are the forces of natural selection that maintained this variation. And so she listened, and then she said, oh, you work on diversity. Never occurred to me. You know, every morning I did my greenhouse work, and then sometimes I would take a bus to the other campus, take my women's studies courses, come back in the evening, but they were very separate worlds. But this is why I think interdisciplinarity is so important, and why we should go have coffee with people, across campus, because there are these little moments that And so that comment got me reading about the history of population biology and evolutionary biology. And like within 2 seconds, you hit the history of eugenics. And yet, all the theorists I was studying in my biology classes were key figures in eugenics. And we today think of eugenics as this horrible movement, but eugenics is really about how do you produce a better society. And so there was a time when people of the left and right were saying, how can science help society? And there were two big visions of that, of some people who said, we want a world of Beethovens and Einsteins, and so only the best and the brightest should be allowed to reproduce, and the rest we should reduce the reproduction. So it's a kind of social, Darwinian vision of the world. But others who said, a good society is one where there's a lot of genetic diversity, which allows you to adapt, based on what comes. So a lot of the, mathematical formulas and theories I was reading were really biologists dealing with these human questions. And so that really, but I had never studied any of that in my biology classrooms, right? And similarly, in my women's studies classrooms, I studied about eugenics, but not about this. And so that really got me. So my first book, Ghost Stories for Darwin, is really about wrestling with how the idea of diversity and difference, of variation in evolutionary biology and diversity and difference really have the same roots, because it's the same people dealing with these questions in two very different spheres of the world. And I think since then, it's been impossible not to think about the world as nature culture. So when I started working on this biology project on native and foreign species, and then I suddenly realized how my own biography was matching the species I was working with. So I've just tried to keep these things together, and then but yet within biology, we act as though native and foreign species are, that it's easy to tell what those are. But really, what is it? 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years? What is a mark of something that's a native species? And this is actually not a definition. And this is true of much of biology, that it is by consensus and sometimes not even consensus. And so you dig a little deep within any of the sciences. All of these variables are operationalized. They've been given some kind of meaning, but those meanings are quite fuzzy sometimes. And so this is why interdisciplinarity, I think, allows you to become a better scientist, because you ask these questions, it forces you to be more precise about how we are defining variables of various kinds. I'm sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to your question.
Hi, I'm Michael. This is kind of outside in the same way that you were kind of going outside and comparing things, but this is on the woo-woo side.
Go for it.
I read an article about this, and I cannot remember the person that did it, but about how God introduces these things to different societies to help mankind or help the species or whatever. And kudzu was mentioned because it is a completely edible plant.
It is.
And we have a lot of people that are starving in this country that don't have nutrition. And the kudzu root is apparently the best starch, better than cornstarch. And it's sold for high prices in other parts of the world. Even here it's sold. And I just wanted to have your thoughts on how things like that are happening. And
That's such a great point, and this is true of so much, right? So we will put herbicides in our lawns so they look pristine, and so we kill the dandelions there, and then we'll go to Whole Foods and pay $8 a bunch to get dandelion greens, right? When it grows in our lawns around us, right? And there's also a wonderful story about the Asian carp, which they introduced into the Great Lakes to eat up the algae, to clean up the Great Lakes. But Asian carp loved the Great Lakes, proliferated. So in China, Asian carp is overfished. It's all been eaten. So now apparently there's a company in the Midwest that catches the Asian carp and mails them back to China. Heaven forbid that we learn how to. We eat a lot of fish. Heaven, that we learn how to, eat that. And there's actually a movement of people who that what we should do is eat our way through the problem, right? that there's so many of these species are species we can eat. They're just not part of our recipes. So there are recipe books that use invasive species. There are restaurants that use invasive species in cooking. So I think this is a good movement to, so in part, other things we know we eat, the things we don't know we don't eat, but we need to figure out a world in which to, incorporate them in our lives. So I think it's I think you should start a movement. I would join it.
Here, I was wondering, given that the idea of like invasion is obviously very problematic and tied to these like fears and xenophobia, would you recommend the idea of like removing the label of invasive from invasive species and replacing it with something else, or do you think it's the name should stay and that like the way we talk about it is where the change has to happen as well?
So to me, I have less of an issue with the term invasive as native and foreign. To me, native and foreign aren't doing very good work for us. And so there are biologists who have suggested and so then this, the question comes up. So sometimes foreign species, so some of these foreign species have been in small numbers and then suddenly they take off. So the question is, why are they taking off now? And my question is, what have we done to our ecosystem that's making them take off now? And so so some biologists would say, well, since invasive species can be only foreign species can be invasive species, we should eradicate all foreign species because you don't know when, they will take off. But there are biologists who suggest other ways in which we could address this issue, so that not every species is likely to be able to take off. So they look at the life history characteristic of the plant, how it grows, what its dispersal modes are, how often it reproduces. So they have like 7 or 8 life history characteristics. And then they argue that if you look at those, the small number of species will qualify. So rather than do these litmus tests of geography and where things come from and add to the xenophobia of the moment, work through those life history characteristics as a way in which to manage the life system. So, do away with this idea of native and foreign as litmus tests of who is here, who belongs, and who doesn't, because that's really, what these ideas are doing. But I think in part the native foreign species does a lot of work for environmentalists, in that it scares us all silly, right? Because we are hearing about this idea of invasion in so many different fronts, of really feeling besieged as a nation. And so I think it does a lot of work in the national politics. And so to me, I'm all for finding other language because I think there is an ecological issue, no doubt about it, but I think we need to find other language that is not xenophobic, that is not stigmatizing, plants, humans, and animals who have come here, who have been brought here, for various reasons to this country, and that we recognize those histories rather than just looking at the snapshot of the present and saying these are evil creatures.
Hi. I wanted to ask your thoughts on this idea that humans were niche constructors, right? And that one of the sort of interesting things about the colonial period, for example, was Europeans failed to appreciate just how constructed some of the environments were because they weren't constructed the same way they were in Europe, so they didn't recognize, for example, farm fields when they saw one because they didn't look the same. And, but I think sometimes environmentalists are hesitant to take on that line because there's a worry that once we admit that humans construct our environments, then it's harder to draw a line and say what kind of interference with the environment is problematic. And so I'm wondering if you could say something about, like, what do you think, could we put our finger on sort of what went wrong with the sort of European colonial style of niche construction that was different from the sort of way in which humans have always sort of constructed their environments?
It was removed from reality?
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand your question. So,
Oh, I don't mean as a challenge so much as just.
no, I
think
understand. No, I wasn't taking it as a challenge. So what you're saying is that when Europeans went to other parts of the world where societies were organized very differently, they did not understand it as social organization.
Right.
Correct? Yeah. Because those people were subhuman, they were more animal-like, they needed to be civilized and brought to European standards. So I think to me the fundamental logic there is about dehumanization, of seeing some people as lesser than, right? And so if we don't do that, if we recognize that there are lots of other ways of living, and some of which are more sustainable in the ways in which we think about the world, rather than short term, we will take everything we can from this environment, extract everything we can from it. I think I'm missing something in your question.
Yeah, I guess there's like a tension between like in the environmental movement, right? A tension between people who want to place humans outside and inside of nature. And part of the reason for that tension is because it seems like once we admit that interfering with and intervening on the environment is okay, you know, for example, when people when indigenous people encourage plants in the Amazon, then there's this worry that opens the floodgates to saying we can do whatever we want, but which isn't true, but.
Absolutely. I get what you're saying. That once you put humans within the environment, then we could just say we are the top species and it is manifest destiny, we eat everything else. Correct?
Yeah, at least that's the worry. Yeah.
No, I think there is a danger in that. I agree there is a danger in that, but I think that the separation hasn't gotten us to a very useful path, right? And that separation allows us to act as though nature is something out there. But I think ultimately what we have to contend with are these different visions of who humans are and what our relationships with the world are. And I think we're going through that at the moment in this country. And these are competing visions that are political visions, right? And I don't know that there's a way around those competing visions of, you know, how we want to live. Because those are ultimately political questions of, you know, what life we are seeking in the world. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Or maybe we could just take a few, is that okay?
That's fine.
Hi, I'm Lubaba. I'm an assistant professor in the English department. And I'm curious about how another term that I think was more popular probably about 10 years ago, but I think still has like salience today, how it fits into the migrant ecologies that you're advocating for, and that's genetically modified organisms. I had the grave misfortune, like 10 or so years ago, to be drawn into diet culture, and so spent a lot of time, tracking where my food came from, whether or not it was genetically modified or not. And at the time, I was an undergrad and was living with other students, one of whom happened to be getting her degree in botany, and she basically was just like, it's extremely elitist of you to be so concerned with GMOs, and I think that's a critique that's been leveled at the movement to label GMO foods, right? That GMOs are kind of a way in which we can feed the entire world, right? So I'm curious, where do GMOs kind of fall in this migrant ecology that you're calling for?
Thank you. Wasn't there another hand up? No?
Hi, I'm also interdisciplinary. I'm in English. I'm also in environmental studies, and I find myself also. I'm curious about your experience at that intersection. if you find yourself pulled between, okay, here's my link, is that I see this wish to ground sort of what we want, like maybe we don't want kudzu taking over, right? The wish to ground that in sort of a moral vision or an external objective reality. And I'm curious, as an interdisciplinary researcher, do you find yourself subject to the sort of tyranny of quantification of quantity over quality? Like, do this draw to ground our arguments in, to make them arguments, to ground them in sort of the qualitative, or to prove it, to prove it via science, the way that we think of proving things, as opposed to having conversations? Do you find yourself also stuck between one being considered more real than the other?
Yeah, great, thanks. They're both great questions. I don't have a problem with GMOs, per se, in the sense of technology is important. But I think that part of the problem, the thing about GMOs is that they're all secret. We don't know what they put in this. We don't know what gene they move from what into what. So to me, I have a problem with how we regulate it, in the sense that so much of it is patented and secret, and so when we are consuming it, we don't know what we are consuming. I also think that GMOs are caught in this perennial thing where technology is like, oh, there are too many people in the world. We need to feed everybody. We can feed everybody in the world today. We produce enough food. But do we? No, right? There's food sitting in warehouses. People are hungry, but they don't have money to buy it. That is the problem, right? So I think the boogie person of the hungry person has been used by technology again and again to say vitamin A rice, or we need to GMO, and this is what we did for hybrid seeds. This is what we did for fertilizer, herbicide. None of them have solved have solved the problem, and so I think we need to stop falling for that argument and thinking in terms of distribution of food and thinking in questions of politics and poverty, because that's at the heart of it. And I think these questions of are GMOs good or bad is, to me, it's a false narrative that keeps our eyes away from the secrecy of the corporatization of so much of our food, that we don't ask the real questions we should be asking, rather than, and so then we avoid those kind of purity politics of, oh, I will only eat organic food that comes from this from this little farm there, right? That kind of, which becomes this elite politics of who can afford, that kind of food. Even though our idea of what organic is, that label has changed, right? Because lobbyists have watered down what it means to be organic, or I love the natural spring water, right? Or, so all those labels are really quite political in how they get regulated. The quantification, that's a really great question. I think one of the things I feel I've learned is we like to think that data convinces people. I don't think it does, right? And so at some point, we need to be producing arguments, qualitative, quantitative, of all kinds, to get at these kinds of political questions. The idea that I will prove it and then the world will see it for what it is has never worked. So I think we also need to expand our ideas of what it means to persuade a public. And I think we need more complex frameworks rather than the quantitative, qualitative, and the best data will win the day.
All right, let's give Professor Subramaniam a round of applause. Thank you so much. That was deeply enriching and stimulating. We do have a few more minutes of our time. If you'd like to purchase a book or get it signed, we do have a hard stop at 6:45. 6:45. But once again, thank you so much. If you'd like to help us improve or if you'd like to suggest programming, please take the survey. With that, please have a safe and wonderful evening.